Hey everyone, welcome back, and in today's video I'll be sharing with you a story about a 10-year-old FM Roman Shogdzhiev who recently played in the Baku Open 2025 with many strong players such as IMs and GMs, and he's put up an insane performance of 5.5 out of 9, and he's played many games wonderfully, which I'll be sharing with you, and hopefully you'll be able to take away a couple of lessons from these games as well. So in the first game, I'm going to be showing you Roman started out with the white pieces, and it's a Sicilian defense, more specifically the Sicilian Taimanov. If you go for a couple of moves, Roman decides to play this queen f3 line, and usually these positions end up getting much sharper, especially when white castles queenside early on. And here after a trade, usually white plays queen g3 to perhaps put his bishop on f4 in the future and kind of eye down against black's dark squares in the future. And in this position, black just closes it up with e5, and here white plays h3 because when black closes up the position, the dark squares with e5, he also opens up the light squares for his light squared bishop, and in this position moves like h4 and then bishop g4 are threats to basically slowly infiltrate into white's position. So here white played h3, and now the computer doesn't like this as it isn't too accurate. The intentions are clear that you basically want to control the g4 square, and in the case of the pawn pushing, you do leave room back in h2, or maybe you can go to f3 and you're fine because, as I said before, the g4 square is covered. And the engine, as I said, doesn't like this because black can get a bit more ahead in development and initiative. The engine prefers moves like bishop e2, just developing the bishop that way and controlling g4 by developing his pieces. But h3 was played, and after h4 white plays queen f3, and after bishop e6 white plays bishop g5, so moving the bishop again but putting pressure on the f6 knight. However, here black simply defends the knight, develops another piece, and here white plays queen e3 because now there wasn't really any purpose on f3, it was just to put pressure on the knight, and now he sidesteps. And this has been somewhat of a slow game by white so far. Roman hasn't really developed his light squared bishop yet, and here black can actually start gaining the initiative with moves like queen a5, basically putting the queen towards more closer to the castled white king, and perhaps looking to create threats in the future with his queenside pawn storm and dark squared bishop. And here white plays a3, so black immediately responds with b5, trying to create weaknesses on the queen side to target and basically open up the white king. And now here white continues with his plan of f4, trying to open up sort of more towards the king side. So at this point, it's both of them are rushing on the opposite sides of boards to create chaos, and eventually one of the opponent's kings will be open. Now here black plays b4, and it's actually engine that prefers black in this position by a significant advantage, around -2 I suppose, because he basically has the tempo and he's already knocking on the door. He's hitting the knight and the pawn, so white needs to respond by taking, and here black plays queen a1 check. And now this is actually a blunder, and it basically gives away most of the advantage because white manages to escape, as you'll see in this game. And after rook comes in with check, the light squared bishop blocks, and after the queen takes on b2, everything's normal, and it's white's move here. Black doesn't have any threats, so white has managed to basically get away. And here he plays rook b2 with tempo, protecting the pawn through x-ray and also hitting the queen, so he doesn't have time to take the pawn with the bishop. If we go back quickly, as I said, queen a1 was a blunder. So what should he have done instead? He should have just simply taken on b4 with the bishop. And let's say white continues developing with a move like bishop d3, blocking the d file and eventually stopping any rook checks. Here, now black gives the check, and after the king moves, now he takes. And in this position, black actually has a threat of taking the knight with the queen or the bishop because the knight is pinned to the king and there's only one defender. So here black basically maintains the pressure because he's making a threat and white has to respond. However, if we go back to the game, after the check and queen takes b2, the bishop isn't on b4 yet, so it's white's move, and he gets the time to play rook b1. And Once the queen moves, now he takes on e5, and now he's threatening to capture knight. So now all of a sudden the advantage shifts towards white because he has the initiative now. And once the knight moves back, the bishop takes on e7, and the queen immediately goes to d4. Now you do align yourself with the rook, but here in this case black has no discoveries that are meaningful, and more importantly white is going to take advantage of the dark squares. As I mentioned earlier in the opening, usually the dark squares are a thing you have to look out for in the Sicilian Taimanov, and in this case white is basically poking holes in black's weaknesses. Here black continues to try to create threats and open up this white king for attack, but he's simply too slow because white first gives a check and then wins another pawn, and he's basically now opening up his knight for access as well. That's the main reason for taking the pawn. Usually you want to keep the initiative going in these types of positions, but capturing the pawn was important, spending a tempo there simply because more pieces can come in. And another thing you have to learn is one piece can't do all the damage, especially since black has a rook, a knight, a light squared bishop around his king. You need to bring more of your pieces to create threats, and as I mentioned, there are no pieces to cover the dark squares really, so the knight can do a really nice job of jumping onto them and attacking the black king. So here black continues with his plan, but at this point it's a bit too late, as now white comes in with knight b5, and he has threats but black doesn't have any threats. And once black saves his queen, the knight comes in with a check and then takes off the light squared bishop off the board, because now the file opens up for the rook, that file. So again, first you're using the dark square weaknesses to bring your piece in, and then you create another weakness of opening the file and opening the king. So again, it's constantly transferring these advantages from one to another, and here white also wins another pawn, and he basically closes up the black king even more. And here black tries to create some counterplay, but white king is simply too safe here, especially with the light squares all covered and no really meaningful ways black can take advantage of the dark squares around. The rook tries to come forward, but again it's white with the initiative, making threat against the king, danger levels, and here he has to block with the knight and give up a piece. And after a simple trade, first black also throws in this check, but white blocks, and in this position black has no checks now, and once the rook takes, the queen just goes back, takes this pawn, and now white is simply up a piece and going to win the game. In fact, he trades the rooks, and after a couple of moves black resigns and white is winning. And now the reason why I showed this game is how Roman basically showed a really nice understanding of basically continuing the initiative. You saw that black was on the front foot and the opening was a bit iffy for white, but he managed to turn the position around after one blunder by making sure he has the initiatives. He uses the dark square weaknesses to bring in his knight and then transfers it over by trading and opening up the file. So it's about knowing when to take advantage of what weakness as well. So in your games, make sure you focus on grabbing the initiative and not letting go once you do, and converting the positions this way. So that's it for this game, and let's go to the next one. So for the second game, we'll be directly skipping to the end game because the opening and middle game were dry in the sense that nothing exciting happened, and it was just players developing their pieces, trying to improve the positions, and a couple of trades, and here we are. So this is a rook endgame, and black is up a pawn. So Roman can try to push and win this. However, it is difficult usually in rook endgames to try and win, and let's see how he manages to push forward. So in this position, he first brings his king out, fixes the pawn structure, and usually a bit of rook shuffling happens around, especially since they're low on time. They're trying to gain some time, trying to have some time to think while they're making the moves. And I can see this from experience. I have moved the rook before a bunch of times as well. Not to random squares per se, but just giving checks, trying to get time, perhaps force the opponent to play a more inaccurate move. So that's what you usually see when players make a bunch of moves that seem random in the rook end games. But going forward, he slowly brings his king up, and then he again keeps moving his rooks, trying to find ways to get the best position, and he throws in a check here, and he forces the king back a square, and now he pushes his g-pawn because he senses this is the optimal time to press forward. And after trade, white plays f3, and I already don't like this move, and same with the engine. It's because you are pushing your pawn a bit forward. It does allow black to create pawn breaks, and in fact black does play g4, and now again the rook will check and the king feels a bit more exposed per se. to checks in the future. And as you see, after, okay, white throws in a check here, and after a trade, it's already a bit iffy for white after he goes to try to defend his pawn as the rook is looking at it. And once he throws a check and reroutes this way, all of a sudden black's pawns work nicely along with the rook to prevent the white king from accessing the f-file and protecting the g-pawn. Same with the rook, it really can't go to f3 and protect because then the rook will get captured. And here the white king moves up and this is already losing, and the idea here white had to play to draw was simply give checks and try to repeat, because if the king goes up he gives another check and there's no way to move forward per se, so he has to go back really, and another check, let's say, goes to f6 or even f7, any squares same like check, and then e7 trying to block the rook off. Then the white rook simply continues to play like rook g8, and he does lose another pawn, but the king goes to f2 and after another check goes here. And what I'm trying to show here is basically the white king kind of blockades, is in front of the pawn, and this other rook will just reroute and give checks, and black is up 2 pawns, but this should be drawn. And of course, as I said before, this is difficult to play as a human, down 2 pawns in a rook endgame, and white has no pawns, and it's usually hard to hold like that. And hence during the game white moves the king forward, loses the pawn, but tries to win back the pawn this way. Now the reason why this doesn't work is because white now plays rook f3, and this is a really key thing that I want to stress in endgames, is that you want to cut off your opponent's king as much as you can. And in this case, the rook will not move from the f-file, and the king is now stuck on the other side of the board and won't basically make any threats too much against the g-pawn when it starts being pushed forward. So now it's basically this rook versus the black king and the pawn. And as you see, in this position the rook moves and gives another check because the pawn and king restrict this king from coming this way. So when you can do that, you give another check and you push the king back in forward. And then here black brings his own king, pushes his own pawn, and in this position it looks like he has no way to go forward. But since the fact that the white king is cut off and he can't access this get access to the other side of the board that quickly, black can do something called building a bridge, which I'll be showing you here. And that's basically the king comes out and is basically going to face the checks, but does a bit of zigzagging. So he zigzags to make sure the pawn is here, and if white gives another check per se, then he can go here, and after another check he'll go and head and block the pawn this way. And after a trade, white king is too far away, and that's why it was important you cut off the white king a couple of files away, so it would be harder for him to access, and you end up building a bridge and winning the game. But in the game, oops, if I go back here, white doesn't give another check because, okay, just as I showed you, the bridge will be built. So here he tries to just come in with his king, but another check, forcing the king back to like even more to the other side of the board, and there's simply no way white can win from here. I mean, sorry, there's no way white can draw from here or even win, yeah. And he resigns, and again Roman pulls off another win from a rook endgame with basically using his knowledge of building the bridge, cutting off the king, and more importantly before, just moving his rook up and down, finding the position to slowly push his pawns forward. And just after f3, that one weak pawn structure move, he breaks through and he ends up winning. And okay, I've decided to just cover 2 games, and if you want to check out more of his games, I'll leave a link down below in the description. Do check it out. And I do have the results page pulled up, and overall he ended up in 13th place. Really amazing performance. As you see, everybody else around him is much higher rated, and simply at 10 years old he's pulled this off. He's got his second IM norm, as you saw, and performance rating of 2514. And as you see his results here, a couple of losses, I mean 2 losses to 2 grandmasters, but he did draw 2 other grandmasters, beat 2 IMs, and honestly amazing results, and all the best to him in his future as well, and all of you who are watching.